All right, A&P. Hopefully your test went well. I'm guessing you won't be watching this one before you take it there. Next chapter we're going to be working on here is the digestive system. To me, in a lot of ways, this one is actually pretty straightforward. The only thing that makes it a little bit more difficult is just the number of organs that are present in here. If we're looking at the system in general, this to me is kind of the take-home message here in terms of what the digestive system needs to do. Really what we're doing here is we're getting the nutrients necessary to maintain the cells and everything else here. So in a simple sense, the digestive system, the whole idea here is to take in whatever our raw materials are. We're going to have to break it down into absorbable forms, absorb the stuff that we need, and get rid of the rest of the crap that we don't, literally. So that's really what we're going to be doing on this one here. When we talk about the digestive system, it does involve a number of organs. We have our actual tubular part here, which is, when you really think about it, it's open to the outside of the body. It's more like the outside of the body, and that's that alimentary canal. Depending on if we're talking about food, bolus, or waste products, it's just that tube that starts at the mouth, ends at the anus, and that everything is passing through. So things that would be a part of this would be the mouth, the pharynx, the esophagus, small intestine, large intestine, along with the stomach. Where the accessory organs, these are the organs that are going to be involved with the digestive process, but the actual food waste products don't pass through them. So this is going to be parts of the system that aid in the digestion, things like the teeth and the tongue, stuff that puts secretion into the alimentary canal, like the salivary glands, the gallbladder, the liver, the pancreas. Again, organs that are definitely involved in the digestive process, but do not actually have the bolus passing through them. Overall, you can kind of see these are some of the different things here. With the alimentary canal is on the right here, talking about what's going on in each of those areas. You can see on the left side here, you have the different accessory organs and what they're doing and how it aids in the process. Again, we're going to be going through all this stuff here, so I'm not going to walk through this figure right now, but you can take a look at it. It's a good review, a good summary of a lot of what we're going to be talking about as we go through this. The alimentary canal is surprisingly long when you really start thinking about it. In terms of feet, you probably have, when you think about the oral cavity and the esophagus, a couple feet there. Let's say another foot for the stomach. And then if you start adding up all the rest of this, we're looking at, in reality, another 21 feet of small intestine, another 8 feet of large intestine. So, overall, you're looking at probably about a 30-foot long tube that is packaged up inside your abdomen, not including the esophagus. One of the things that's interesting about this is if you actually look at the structure of the actual tube, it's pretty similar throughout. It has the same basic layers to it, with the exception of the serosa, sometimes an adventitia. But we have the same basic layers. You're going to have a mucosal lining, which is going to be epithelium with some underlying connective tissue and a little bit of muscle tissue. You're then going to have a submucosa. Beneath that, we're going to have a muscularis layer or a muscular layer, and then a serosa or adventitia, depending on if we're in the peritoneum or not. Again, these same basic 4 layers are going to be present in all of them. What we will see is, depending on what the particular organ is doing, we may see differences in the epithelium, differences in the muscle layer. Some of the submucosal glands might be different depending on where we're talking about. So you can look at the basic layers on this one right here. You can see the mucosa. We'll zoom in on each of these a little bit more, but you can see it's mainly epithelium, a lot of connective tissue and some glandular stuff in the submucosa. The muscularis is not surprisingly smooth muscle. And then, like I said, the serosa will be connective tissue, and again, may be an adventitia if we're not within the peritoneum. So the esophagus, for example, is not within the peritoneum. It does not have a serosa lining. It has an adventitia around the outside. So the mucosa, it is what's going to be interacting with the nutrients here, whatever you take in that bolus. It's involved in a lot of secretion of enzymes, sometimes in hormones, definitely a lot of mucus. Mucosal lining, we'll see, tends to get more and more mucus the further we get towards the end of the digestive tract. It is protecting those inner layers from what we might have ingested, and is allowing us to really have the ability to absorb a lot of the stuff that we're ingesting. So nutrients, water, and other things that are going to be important for us. And we're going to see that there's 3 main sublayers to this. You're going to have the epithelium, which through a lot of the digestive tract is going to be simple columnar. We're going to see that's not the case everywhere. There you do have then underlying that epithelium some really a little bit more loose connective tissue in a lot of areas called the lamina propria. And then underlying that we have just a small layer of muscularis called the muscularis mucosae. And we'll take a look at each of these. So you can see on this one, the epithelium is this lining right here. You can see a lot of goblet cells present in that. You can then see this lamina propria is this connective tissue that's underlying that. Space for nerves, blood vessels, lymphatics to travel through. And then you're going to see right here a very thin layer of smooth muscle that can provide a little bit of tension to that actual mucosal layer made out of that smooth muscle. And again, this allows us to allow this absorption, getting it to the blood vessels, getting it to the lymphatics that are going to be important for us here. Submucosa is going to have some some loose connective tissue near the surface of this, getting closer to that mucosa. We will then have some dense connective tissue underlying that. What we're going to see here is this is where a lot of the wiring and plumbing is going to be. So lots of blood vessels, lots of lymphatic vessels and lymph nodes, as well as nerves supplying all this tissue. The muscularis externa is going to be those two main layers of muscle that we find throughout the digestive tract. You're going to have usually, if this pen was the tube, you're going to have an inner circular layer that surrounds it like that. And then you're going to have a longitudinal layer that kind of goes on it like this. And it's really the combination of those two layers that allows peristalsis to happen, which is that shortening of the food in front, shortening of the tube in front of the bolus, and a squeezing of that tube behind the bolus. I always kind of say peristalsis is a lot like if you ever accidentally unthread your hoodie. Sometimes you have to try to thread that hoodie back through the opening, and a lot of times you're squeezing, pushing, shortening the tube in front of that, and then pinching behind the front of the hoodie tie to try to get it to move through there. We'll take a look at a picture of one of these here. So again, with this, we do have a couple types of motility. Like I said, usually peristalsis is moving stuff in that rectal direction. Segmentation, a lot of times you can see on the right side of this image where you're going to be doing some movements that are not really moving in one direction or another, but a back and forth to try to absorb more nutrients, mix stuff up a little bit more. That's going to happen with these different layers of smooth muscle. And you can see it on the picture right here. This is the inner circular layer, and then you're seeing basically a transverse section or a cross section of the muscle in that longitudinal section on the bottom of this image right here. And you can see some of that submucosa right here with these large lymphatic things right here. That's all submucosal, and then you can see the mucosal layer from about here up. Like I said, the outermost layer for intraperitoneal organs is going to be a serosa. In these things that are not in the peritoneum, so parts of the duodenum and the colon as well as the esophagus have an adventitia instead of a serosa. It's really kind of a similar layer of connective tissue surrounding this, just not found within those serous cavities. Again, mainly areolar connective tissue outside the peritoneum. Inside there, you're going to have that visceral peritoneum, which has an epithelial layer. That's really the main difference between these two. Again, both of them being that outermost layer of that digestive tract. And you can see sometimes it's going to be, you can see all the layers again right here, sometimes continuous with some of the mesentery, which helps hold all the digestive organs in place. You can see those different muscular layers as well as the mucosa and submucosa on this image. And again, this thing just gives you a nice little summary of this, kind of what is the mucosa made up of, what is its job, same thing with the submucosa and those different layers that are further in from the opening in the tube, the lumen of the tube there, so the muscular and the serosa. One of the things I do want to point out on this is, again, same 4 layers throughout. You're going to have a mucosa, submucosa, muscularis, and that serosa / adventitia. One of the things you can notice, though, is that the esophagus, the epithelium, is stratified squamous. It's really protective and trying to make sure you don't damage it there. Where you can see in the stomach, we get a change to simple columnar and changes in the look of that mucosa. When we get to the small intestine, you can see it changes again. We can see in the stomach, you also have changes in that muscularis layer. You get an extra layer there. The other thing you see is within the submucosa, you're going to see some differences in the small intestine versus the large intestine versus the esophagus and what we would find in those layers. So again, same 4 basic layers throughout, but the composition of these layers may be a little bit different depending on what the job of that particular organ is. One of the things that's also going to help regulate moving stuff through here is we are going to have different receptors that are going to be taking a look at sometimes what the contents are as well as how full the tube is. So we're going to have mechanoreceptors that a lot of times can deal with stretch or pressure on these particular receptors. And sometimes if those are more active or not, it might mean that we do more mixing and more segmentation and less peristalsis. Other things we can do is look at what are some of the nutrients that are in this by having different chemoreceptors that are going to recognize and allow the body to do different things about what is within the contents of what you've ingested. On top of that, we do have a lot of sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system control through the central nervous system, regulating a lot of these different areas here. So up near the head and neck, it's going to be a lot more of those cranial nerves. So things like the facial, glossopharyngeal. As we get to more of the abdominal organs, a lot more of the vagus nerve innervating that, as well as some of the sympathetic inputs from the lumbar and thoracolumbar regions of that. We see there is also some local reflexes that deal with stretch and other stuff like that to allow some kind of almost automatic control of the digestive tract here. The other thing we're going to see, and we'll get into this later on, is that there is a little bit more endocrine than most people expect in the digestive tract. There is, between the stomach and the small intestines, a little bit of hormonal interplay with things like gastrin, secretin, and something called cholecystokinin, a lot of times shortened to CCK. We'll talk about all of these in a little bit more detail when we get to the stomach and the small intestines and what's going on there. Again, just to kind of warn you, a little bit more endocrine involved than what most people realize. So what we'll start doing after this one here is we're going to start working our way through the alimentary canal, making our way down from the oral cavity through all these different areas and looking at some of those basic digestive processes. So I'll see you next time.